Welcome, everybody. I'm Jonathan Zeitlin. I'm a professor of public policy and governance at the University of Amsterdam and also a member of the steering committee of the standing group on the EU that is sponsoring, is organizing this monthly seminar series. We're very excited. This is our first such monthly seminar series. There'll always be on the third Thursday of every month. We'll have one monthly through April, and if it's successful, we'll do it again next year. The idea is to create a forum in which members of the standing group, which is, by the way, the biggest standing group of the ECPR, can meet each other and discuss ongoing research on topical issues and cutting edge methods in between the annual or biannual meetings of the standing group. So we're very happy that our first speaker is also our chair, Virginie Guiraudon, from Sciences Po Paris. And she is doing something which is also very brave, which is that she's going to talk about a current issue, the EU's attitudes towards Afghan refugees, and she's going to present an analytical framework based on all the research that not only she, but the whole community of scholars studying EU immigration and asylum policies have developed, and see how what we've learned or what we think we've learned in the past 2 or 3 decades can be applied to explain an unfolding event. So let me just very briefly introduce the speaker and the discussant, and then I will turn it over to Virginie. So she is CNRS Research Director at the Sciences Po Center for European and Comparative Studies in Paris. She's worked very widely on the comparative politics of immigration and citizenship, and in recent years has focused on the drivers and effects of the Europeanization of immigration, asylum, and border policies. And our discussant, Florian Trauner, is also a leading scholar of EU migration and asylum policies. He holds a Jean Monnet chair called Expand, Explaining Resilience in EU Justice and Home Affairs at the Brussel School of Governance of the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, the VUB in Brussels, where he also directs an interdisciplinary research center on migration and minorities. His own research also focuses on EU asylum, migration, border control, counterterrorism policies, and linkages between EU internal security and external relations and foreign policy. The format is that Virginie will talk for about 30 minutes. She'll use a few slides. Then Florian will comment for 5 to 10 minutes. If we're not running too far behind time, I'll give Virginie a chance briefly to respond, and then we'll open to Q&A and discussion with you, the audience. So Virginie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So I'm going to first respond as chair of the Standing Group on the European Union. I'm very happy that we're launching this series. There are very, very bad things about the COVID-19 pandemic, and we haven't seen each other in person for a while. I'm happy to report that we will all see each other in Rome in June 2022. But at the same time, we thought that, well, you know, we got accustomed to meeting online, and for many of our members, it's actually a nice way of being able to exchange research results, research projects, and and to exchange about the state of EU studies in general. So in a way, this online seminar series, in a way, thanks to Jonathan and Natalie, was a way of saying, well, let's make the most of it. After all, we've been on Zoom forever, but it might be a good way of connecting to our members, even you know, after the pandemic or almost after the pandemic. So I'm done. Indeed, as Jonathan mentioned, I'm going to do something a little bit risky today. I'm going to try to connect to a recent event, the fall of Kabul on August 15th, 2021, and the reaction of the EU when it comes to welcoming people who might want to leave Afghanistan in this situation, as a way of also showcasing what EU studies and people who have been working in this field for a long time can bring to the discussion. I've been trained in the US, so I'm used to actually presenting alternative explanations and different frameworks of explanation. But I thought it would be a good idea, and I really welcome Florian Trauner as my discussant, because he didn't get a full, you know, a full paper to discuss, right? At the same time, he's been working on the subject for so long that I'm sure he has a lot to say about it. And I'm really happy to see our discussants. So when we had this seminar series idea, you know, we were actually in the middle of the fall of Kabul, and it's only a couple of months now, and some of you have probably forgotten what's happening there, but we thought it would be a good way to start. So the title of my talk is The EU's Attitude Towards Afghan Refugees, Analytical Framework to Account for EU Immigration Policy. It was very striking, even for people who have been working in this field, to see the reaction of the EU Commission, and very quickly after that, the Council of Ministers of Home Affairs. In 2015, the buzzword was crisis. It was a refugee crisis, an asylum crisis, a crisis of Europe. But this time there was almost like a panic, you know, there was almost a panic on the part of EU institutions saying, oh my God, we cannot deal with another Syrian-like crisis. And so I'll very briefly explain what the reactions were, and then go on very quickly on understanding how can we understand this particular reaction, basically from August to October, and try to understand what can how can we explain this reaction based on two different kinds of perspective. One which would be much more long-term, based on how did asylum, immigration, and borders policy emerge in the EU, and what kind of policies really, what can we call EU policy. One which is more recent, not that recent anymore, but that focuses more on the last 10 years or so, and that focuses on the fact that immigration and asylum has become politicized, not just at the national level, which we all know about, but at the EU level, and a subject of polarization also among member states, so that even at EU summits or in other ways, you have EU leaders talking about immigration. So it's not just a national issue, but also that the EU has become a sort of forum where immigration is used as a way of for national political leaders to make waves, so to speak. And I'll try to conclude very briefly on the consequences of the fact that EU borders is both in a case of policy inertia or drift, has not changed for the last 20 or 30 years, but also in a context where it's highly politicized, which was not the original idea. So very quickly, I want to start from the example of the fall of Kabul. I could have taken other examples, by the way. As you know, today there is an EU Council where Poland is meant to respond to the fact that its court has decided not to respect the supremacy of EU law, but where there's a lot of discussion on the fact that there are persons trying to cross from Belarus to Poland and the Balkan states. So the question of immigration and asylum actually is not just a very, you know, it comes across in many kinds of discussions. But I wanted to take the example of Kabul to give you an idea of what can the EU do and how does the EU respond in this kind of situation. As you all know, on the 15th of August 2021, there was the famous fall of Kabul, sort of unexpected. And there was a very quick reaction from the EU Commission first. And its first reaction was really to say, we want to avoid another crisis. So the word crisis, as you know, is very used in EU politics and policies. There was the Euro crisis, there was a constitutional crisis, and in 2015, the EU refugee crisis. And the first reaction of the EU Commission was to say, we don't want another crisis. And it pledged to about 200 million in humanitarian development assistance to Afghanistan, which is nothing, by the way, to the amount that it was actually supposed to give to Afghanistan without the Taliban. And very quickly, only 2 weeks after that, there was a meeting of the 27 ministers of Home Affairs, a council of ministers, focusing on the idea that they did not want anyone to come to the EU, and therefore they would focus financial aid to neighboring countries, mostly Pakistan. There are other neighboring countries, but they did not want to welcome any refugees for that matter, Turkmenistan or Tajikistan. So basically they pledged money. So 200 million, now 300 million at the last time I checked, from the EU Commission for aid, and 600 million for neighboring countries would welcome refugees. And they also called for EU agencies to intervene. So Frontex, who is in charge of external borders, the European agency in charge of asylum, and Europol, to make sure that none of the people who wanted to come to Europe were terrorist risk or criminal risk. So I just want to give you an idea of what the Council of Ministers meeting minutes said at the end. All the bold number, whatever is in bold is mine, right? So based on lessons learned, the EU and its member states wanted to jointly prevent the recurrence of uncontrolled, large-scale, illegal migration movement faced in the past. That first statement is clearly interesting because it means that in 2021, there is almost a trauma on the part of the Council of Ministers, but also the Commission, if you read their statements, that we do not want another 2015, that the European Union as a set of institutions and member states as part of that were unable to deal with Syrian refugees coming into the EU. So there's this, and the word trauma is probably excessive, but there's this really emphasis that before any Afghan refugee ever left Afghanistan, the EU has responded as if there were another million persons trying to reach the EU. In the same paragraph, it's the Council of Ministers also states, we have to support the countries in Afghanistan's immediate neighborhood. And that's the idea. So the idea is not that the EU welcomes Afghan refugees, but that the solution is to provide aid to the immediate neighborhood. As I said, it's mostly Pakistan, actually, at this point. And then in the same paragraph again, there is this idea that there is the need to combat the narrative used by smugglers, including in the online environment, which encourage people to embark on dangerous and illegal journeys towards Europe. And there, if you know the situation, it's unclear that this has anything to do with Afghanistan. Florian Trauner, you know very well because you're involved in research projects on that, right? That there is the EU in particular, but but also countries hire the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, precisely to set up information campaigns in countries of origin of transit of migrants to say that, you know, don't go to Europe, it's dangerous, you shouldn't go there. So there's a mix. There's on the 31st of August 2021, there's a statement about Afghanistan, but already you can see that there's also a lot of confusion because it refers to ongoing EU policies in connection to other international organizations such as the IOM to prevent illegal journeys. In the statement of the Council of Ministers meeting, there are 5 uses of the word illegal migration. And why should I focus on that is, well, we are talking about Afghanistan on the 31st of August, where most countries are having this contradictory discourse, right? Where they are very, very unhappy about the situation. They're worried about the situation of women there. They are worried. So that the fact that the Council of Ministers only focuses on illegal migration movements seems to be a little bit out of sync with the discourses on the fact that the situation in Afghanistan is not just a humanitarian crisis, but also, of course, basically is a real failure of not just actually the US intervention, but of also EU involvement in the region. So the focus is just on preventing these illegal movements. In the same statement following Afghanistan, for instance, there is, and I put it in red, there is a little, another statement that says, the Council will closely follow developments in the area of international protection, migration, and security. It will respond to attempts to instrumentalize migration for political purposes and other hybrid threats. So I'm not going to do a word-by-word explanation, but in the same statement on Afghanistan, what's interesting is the EU Council of Ministers, meaning the Ministers of Home Affairs, are already thinking about the situation in Belarus. So the fact that because the EU puts so much emphasis on preventing people from accessing Europe, that they give a lot of power to the neighboring states. And as some of you may have followed, Belarus has used migration as a sort of threat for the EU. To make it more concrete, when the EU did not recognize the results of the elections in Belarus, the government of Belarus started to encourage people to come very cheaply from Iraq and including also from Afghanistan at the time, to come to Belarus and put them at the border between Belarus and the EU border, meaning basically the Balkan states and Poland. So in the same statement that's just supposed to be about Afghanistan, there is a statement that says that some states are trying to instrumentalize migration for political purposes. So the EU is actually aware that the very fact that it's so worried about inflows, people coming through its borders, that it's actually aware that some states might exploit it politically. But just to go back to the chronology. So already the first reaction in just at the end of August is the idea that the EU will not welcome any refugees and will instead actually give money to neighboring countries, or a little bit of money also for humanitarian assistance. Then nothing happened. There was no major flows of Afghans trying to leave Afghanistan. There was no equivalent to what the EU experienced in 2015. And the last event related to the EU and Afghan refugee was in October, early in the month, where there was a multilateral high-level forum, actually at the initiative of the EU commissioner. And the UNHCR commissioner asked the EU to take 42,500 displaced refugees. So these are the people who are already left Afghanistan on the airplanes that the US mainly organized in August, who are now in Dubai or other places. And so it was a forum where everybody had to say, how many people do you want to take in? Canada pledged to take 40,000, the US 60,000, the UK, who is no longer in the EU, 5,000. And so they asked the EU to take 42,500, which is basically what Canada has pledged to do. And the EU commissioner was not able to say whether that was possible. The EU commissioner just said, it's doable. I quote, it's doable. But was not in any position to say what member states would commit to do, and just reiterated the same thing that had been said in August, that the priority was to give money to Pakistan and others, and to give money for humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. So the reaction seems, I mean, Canada, I'm Canadian, by the way, so I'm probably biased. But the fact that Canada pledges 40,000 and the EU cannot commit to 42,500 refugees. So these are people who are already somewhere in, out of Afghanistan. They're just trying to be resettled. They're not knocking at the door. So what we call resettlement in this field is people will be identified and then sent to another countries. And of course, the question is, why cannot the EU do more? And why cannot the EU commissioner commit, in some sense, to, on behalf of the 27 member states, and say, yes, we will take these 40,000 displaced refugees from Afghanistan. So it might be shocking to those who don't know the field and say, well, it doesn't seem to be, it seems to be such a small number, right? I mean, 40,000 people, it is a very small number compared to the number of migrants, international migrants, legal international migrants coming into the EU every year. So my take on this is, there's probably misunderstanding about what EU immigration, asylum, and borders policy is about. And there's two ways of looking at it. My take on this is there are two ways of trying to frame this problem. One is to say EU immigration, asylum, borders policy was never about welcoming asylum seekers. It was never about also welcoming immigration, meaning selecting migrants. It was only about border controls. And there's a sort of perception that there's such a thing as a common immigration, asylum, and borders policy. So if you go back to the origins, if you go back to the reasons why there was, why the original 5 member states who signed Schengen and those who joined them decided to go to the EU level, it was never about dealing with this kind of situation. The other way of looking at this is to say there has been actually a change in the last, of course, since the crisis that involves Syria, but probably even since the years after enlargement, where immigration asylum became a really high politics question. So we all know that immigration can be a cleavage in national politics. It can be used by a number of parties to win elections, but it's not supposed to be an EU high politics issue. And the real difference, I would say, since a little bit before, and of course since the EU crisis in 2015, is the fact that it's every Council of Ministers, every high summit between leaders, every big discussion, even in other institutions such as Parliament, focuses on immigration, and it is used by what you might call populist leaders, or in any case, some heads of states and governments, as a vehicle to showcase their own policy, and that was not made the same. So the question is, do you want to have a long-term perspective? Or to look also at what's been happening in the last few years that has just exacerbated the fact that the EU cannot really do more than offer money to third states and countries to prevent Afghans from reaching the EU border. My understanding is, my preference, because I've been working on this issue, and that's why I would love to be challenged on that, is that from the beginning, what's called EU immigration, asylum, and borders policy was never about immigration and asylum. It was mostly about border controls. This policy started as Schengen in 1985 and an agreement in 1990, mostly trying to prevent undesirable migrants, and of course you can ask me what this means, to enter the EU. From when it became actually an EU policy, the border was the focus was still on trying to prevent people from arriving on European soil, because then it would be very hard to deport them. It would be very hard to send them back home, but also there was this idea that there was a modicum of rights in the EU that would make it hard for them not to stay. So if you have an historical perspective, you would think that the reaction to the Afghan crisis was already written, I would say, in the 1980s. It was, there was never any idea that EU policy would somehow be able to deal with this kind of situation. A second perspective, which is complementary and I think interesting, is that one thing that was not anticipated when that policy was created was the fact that it would become high politics. Of course, I'm not even going back to 1985, but even when EU policy became completely a EU policy, I would say, at the after Maastricht and Amsterdam. So in force in 1989, with the first real EU decisions in the 2000s, there was not an idea that it would become an occasion for EU member states to have a forum for their own domestic politics. And this was not, I think, anticipated by the founders of Schengen or Dublin or any other treaties. And this became clear, of course, in 2015 when you had countries, of course, in the east and central parts of Europe who used EU summits as a way of expressing their dislike both for immigration and for European integration. And EU institutions were very ill-equipped to respond to that in a way. There had been examples before, you know, like Berlusconi at one point, but it was more like once in a while, of course, you would have one political leader making a show, while this time it was much more organized in a way. So the combination of the fact that, in fact, EU policy was made only by basically interior and justice Home Affairs officials who wanted to focus on borders and not immigration and asylum, and the polarization that followed makes it very difficult to foresee any kind of other solution than what happened in August 2021 when it came to dealing with the Afghan crisis. Because the only solution then is to focus on delegating border control to third countries. A lot of money has been given in the EU budget to Frontex, which actually controls external borders, but the main focus from the beginning has been to say we will somehow delegate control in the way in political science and economics we mean delegation, meaning there's a principle, the EU, who delegates to an agent, which is Turkey, which is Libya, Morocco, who knows now, maybe Pakistan, to be the one who actually engages in border control. And this has been the lowest common denominator, to use a famous phrase from EU studies from intergovernmentalism. The default position has been, since no member states can agree, for instance, on sharing refugees or having some kind of a solidarity policy among member states from the south or from the east, the easiest thing is to just give more money, either to fund third countries or at least to Frontex. To conclude, I would say that there's a problem with that is, and I see it even today with the council meeting where Poland will be told that they cannot, that they have to respect the EU supremacy when it comes to legal decisions in Poland, is the way that the EU acts in this particular area, which is immigration, asylum, borders policy, is often very, very contradictory. To give an example back to Belarus, not Afghanistan, the EU is very happy to help Belarus with the Frontex agency to patrol the borders, to prevent people coming from Belarus into the EU. And at the same time, it's criticizing Poland for wanting to build a wall between Belarus and Poland. So the EU is at the stage where it's somehow criticizing some of the East and Central European states for not respecting human rights, the rule of law, and at the same time cooperating with them when it comes to controlling its external borders. So to conclude, yes, I think the crisis in Afghanistan gives us a vision of how little actually the EU specifically in terms of EU institution is able to do, and why it may just be because we are expecting too much from what really is exclusively at this point a policy of bordering, and not so much a policy of common immigration and asylum.
Great, thanks very much, Virginie. There's a lot to discuss there, and I'm sure that our audience will be anxious to comment and pose some questions. First, however, I'll give the floor to our discussant, Florian Trauner. So Florian, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Virginie, for giving me the opportunity to come in this interesting thought development. Let's say it like this. It's a big honor. I mean, I think your work on the early stages and the later stages of EU migration policy development has really influenced the whole generation of scholars interested in these issues. So being right now able to discuss with you, what's going on right now is a big pleasure. So let's start a bit what you said about this inertia and what's happening really at European Union level. First point probably could be a discussion to what normal, you mentioned as well, this long-term development interacts with more the crisis responses that we are seeing. So I think in terms of long-term law development, there's a relatively big consensus in the literature that really not much is happening as such. There's a very stable policy core. We have seen that the negotiations, new countries or countries in the East that used to be in the sidelines are right now much more active. Scipione said it is a failing forward. So really not much is going on in terms of big law development. But at the same time, does this mean that really big things are not happening? And there I would say this is not the case, because the real big things that are going on are happening at member state level. And there, let me go to one of the major points that you said. Was it always about only border control, never really about asylum policies? And here I would tend to disagree, because from member states level, I think the asylum component in the EU's policy was always very important. I think it always depends how you view asylum at European Union level. Do you view it as a kind of an effort to develop common protection standards, or do you have a much more instrumental view on asylum policy at European Union level? And here we could say that some member states have always used the EU's asylum policy as a kind of a way to direct migration flows that are unwanted from their perspective towards other member states. So there was a very instrumental view of asylum policy, which was crucial for a core group of member states in the overall EU's policy development. So this, we have seen that this was established in the beginning, the Dublin regime, and it was impossible to develop kind of in a long term in a legal process. But what we are seeing right now is that other member states more and more, they contest it by informal practices, by illiberal practices, if you want to say so. We see quite some open neglect of European Union law. We see member states really, basically, I mean, being very, how to say, or embarking on very contested practices, so that this, the whole system at member states level is more and more kind of almost falling apart. So we can see, okay, this is a bit different, but what I say is that, was it never about asylum? It always depends how you view it. You see, from the member states level or from a European Union level. But you're saying that it was only about border control. It seems that you refer to the EU as a whole, but within the EU, the different groups, it was very much about asylum policy as well. But it was so much contested that right now you see groups of member states really being unable to move forward on a common level, with some member states more and more embarking on the others, and we see a kind of a divergence at member states level. So this is creating polarization. This is creating an impossible to move forward with a common European policy. So there we are coming back to what you said. What is the response? The response is you embark on a very strong level of border control policies and on externalization in a way. So I think this is the way. But here again, it's quite interesting to see, even in the border control policies that you mentioned very strongly in your presentation, they are very selectively used. And one of the key, or a very interesting thing right now, what is happening in the Baltic states of Poland, is that Frontex, one of the key winners of the whole crisis, is proactively not used by Poland, for instance. It's not being sent there because here again, Europeanization in this way is possibly seen as a constraint for national, very contested, illiberal practices as well. So I think what is really a very interesting thing to research right now is this selective or the non-use of European opportunities by certain member states, at certain member states level in a crisis situation that we have right now at the eastern border and that we possibly have in the future right now with the Afghan crisis. And this is something, this brings me already a bit to the role of third countries. I was last week on a panel with some migration scholars from Turkey, and they said that in Turkey there are estimates that already 1 million Afghan people came to Turkey, but that the issue is not being politicized yet because Erdogan waits until the election is coming closer. So there would be re-election of the president in 2023, but many people assume that the re-election will take place already next summer. So migration scholars from Turkey said they assume that next spring the Afghan issue will be politicized vis-a-vis the EU once it's bringing kind of political advantages for the President Erdogan and his government. So this brings us a bit to the externalization. Indeed, the European Union has, by monofocusing only on the restrictive sides and saying, okay, we will solve everything by pouring money on it, how to say, it has given away a bit agency, and it has become more easily put under pressure by regimes really wanting to challenge the European Union. It has been very, I mean, I'm sure it's very closely followed what's going on right now with Belarus and the European Union. It's a big challenge and will be very interesting to follow how the EU is reacting, how it's reacting to such pressure, and what's going on. Okay, I think these are some of the points that I wanted to make a bit spontaneously. But they may give you some food for thought already, and we can come back in the debate and by bringing in some other people from the audience. Thanks, thanks a lot for your interesting presentation.
Thanks, Florian. So can I already start to see who would like to come into the discussion? So you can put your hands up virtually with the reactions. In the meantime, maybe first I give Virginie a chance to react to what Florian has said, and I also have some questions and comments for you, Virginie, but I will save them. We'll see if we start to get a broader discussion. So go ahead, Virginie.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Florian. I think I just want to respond to this issue of externalization, because as Florian mentioned and as I mentioned, I mean, it's, you know, we have this situation in Belarus where this dictator thinks he knows that somehow migration is such a hot issue that it's a good way of getting attention, basically, from the EU. But I agree with Florian. Do you want to have the EU intervene, or do you want to be in charge? And I think Poland actually in this particular situation is interesting. Usually you do both, by the way. I mean, you want Frontex to come in and you build your own wall. That's what's been happening recently. But the more general question is, by making migration a hot issue, you are signaling third states that this is going to be a way to bargain, a real advantage in international negotiations. So we of course we've seen it when Gaddafi was still around. We've seen it of course for Turkey until February 2020, when just before when we were all preparing for COVID and lockdown, at the last minute, I would say Erdogan sent people to the Greek border to put pressure on the EU, saying that he was not happy with the deal he had gotten in 2016. We've seen it in Morocco, in its dealing with Spain, for instance. And of course, it's a Spanish-Moroccan issue, but at the same time, it involves the EU. So the more that you make this issue a high politics issue, the more it becomes actually a problem in international negotiations. If it was not such an issue, which it wasn't for until quite recently, you could say, I mean, look at the numbers when it comes to Belarus. You could just say, okay, you want to send us 10,000 people, okay. I mean, what's the big deal? It's not but they know that it's such a political polarized issue, and it's become such a high priority in EU politics that it's become a way to bargain with the EU. So I guess that was the point I was making.
Thanks, Virginie. Okay, again, I invite people to put their hands up, but in the meantime, let me also react a bit and pose some questions. So you, and I see Virginia Pasalacqua, and Virginia, I'll come to you in just a moment after I exchange a little with Virginie. So just hang on. You emphasize, broadly speaking, two dimensions. One is the long-term continuities in terms of EU policy in this area and trying to control borders. The other is what you call the trauma of the 2015 refugee crisis. And I wonder if one, shouldn't, connect these more strongly, because although we do see inertia and deadlock, we've also seen a lot of movement and activity, which has not really, it hasn't yielded results. But if you were focusing on policy proposals, governance developments, and so on, you would not necessarily see it in terms of inertia, but rather difficulties of eventually reaching a consensus and taking steps. So there, the kind of key turning point, which you didn't mention, was the failure of the refugee reallocation key, which was agreed in 2015 by the Council. And that could have been a really momentous turning point. It involved a decision, a legally binding decision taken by qualified majority vote in the Council, but which then proved impossible to implement. And it seems to me that that's part of the trauma for the EU institutions, because they already played what might have been considered to be their strongest card. And it's one of the most conspicuous cases of refusal of member states to observe a legally binding decision taken at EU level. And then, secondly, in terms of the developments under the surface, the negotiations over the asylum package, many components of which have been agreed in principle, and the strengthening not only of Frontex, but also of EASO to turn it into an EU asylum agency. If one looks at it from a governance point of view, these could be very important developments, but for the moment, they remain blocked because it doesn't seem possible to implement the things that have already been agreed until everything is agreed. And then finally, on your last point, the conflict between EU policies and EU values. What's striking as somebody who's just observing rather than really studying these issues is the extent to which the EU seems to be coming in all sorts of ways into conflict with its obligations under the UN and European Council of Europe instruments on the rights of refugees. And the question is, how long can the EU maintain the claim that it supports the international right of asylum and non-refoulement while its member states and also Frontex engage in pushbacks? So maybe you can respond to those 3 points, and then we start to take questions from the audience.
Thanks, Jonathan. These are great questions. The first thing about the trauma of 2015, I mean, what's interesting here is to compare with other policy domains. I mean, when we had, I mean, after the pandemic, in the decisions on, the new plan for investment in Europe, the idea was we're not going to do like 2007 and 2008. We're going to do something different. So the idea was precisely to say, the Germans have to change. This was not what happened in the immigration asylum. There was like a panic, like, oh no, we do not want to have 2015. We're going to be, there will be no one coming in. So if you look at, the question of the economy, the funds after the pandemic, and if you compare it to immigration asylum, it's completely different. In the situation on immigration asylum was like, it's like a panic. It's no longer a crisis. Like because there was such indeed, and that's what you mentioned. From 2015 onwards, nothing worked at the EU level. Decisions were taken, not respected. The Parliament voted on the reform of Dublin. It was not accepted by the Council. There was nothing that worked in terms of EU institutions. It was just, the Parliament did their job, but the Council didn't follow. Or yes, the decision was taken, but that and it took 5 years, by the way, for the EU court to say that Poland and Hungary should have respected the quotas of reallocation. So it was 2015, it's not just a trauma in terms of what happened then, it's more the fact that the EU institutional system never somehow came to a solution. So it's not so much what happened in 2015, it's the fact that the Commission got weakened, the Parliament did its job, but it didn't get anywhere. So it's this idea that and then there was a pact that was issued in September 2020, which was a joke actually for most observers, trying to solve all of this problem of the gridlock in terms of immigration asylum by offering very complex logistical solutions to political problems, saying, okay, so you don't want to welcome asylum seekers, maybe you can pay 2,000 euros to help deport them. I mean, it was, there was no obvious solution clearly from the Commission. So immigration asylum is very different in that way, and I think it's interesting to compare with other policy areas to what happened when it came to Europe in the case of COVID and this huge decision from Germany, of course, and other member states to go forward with a plan after COVID. So it's not a good example in a way, but it's a different policy area. It was not, I think, meant to be as EU or as community like as others. And then as far as your question on the values and this contradiction, I think we passed that line a long time ago. But it's not the end of it, because more and more countries, for instance, are not respecting, for instance, the Council of Europe decisions, the EC, the European Court of Human Rights decision, but many of the practices of European agencies are not respecting basic Council of Europe or international rights decisions. So that's why I say it's a contradiction. I mean, you're criticizing Poland and Hungary as the European Commission, and at the same time you have EU agencies, executive agencies, who are, not respecting asylum rights. So it's something that will have to be, I think, dealt with. Frontex has been, under fire a little bit more than usual, but it's like, it's not easy to be the one who says, as you say, yes, giving lessons about human rights in this area, where it's, in fact, it's EU agencies not respecting asylum, for instance, the right to asylum, for instance.
Thanks, Virginie. It's a very sad story. So now we have a couple of questions. The one in the chat from Karina Smerakova, and one in person from Virginia Pasalacqua. So Virginia, can I ask you to put on your camera, unmute yourself, and introduce yourself, and then ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, hello to everybody. I'm not sure that my connection is so stable to have the video. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
It's fine.
Ah, that's wonderful, great. So my name is Virginia Pasalacqua, and I work for Utrecht University as a postdoc in law, actually, EU law and migration. So, but still, I have been very much influenced by Professor Guiraudon writings on the foundation on European migration policy. So thanks a lot for your talk, and I really appreciate the attempt also to have an analytical framework that can bring us from the beginning of EU migration policy until today. That's fascinating. I just have a comment and a reflection that I want to share with you. First, I think that your theory on venue shopping really helped me understanding what was the reason behind the creation of the asylum and migration policy at the EU level. And I largely agree with you that the venue shopping kind of mindset, the border control mindset, helps us understand what's happening now with the externalization. So the idea that member states first shifted their responsibility to the EU level, and then the EU now is shifting its responsibility to the external third countries that have more uncontrolled powers. So they do not respect human rights, that are not circumscribed by courts, they do not have political opposition, where they just, prevent people from arriving in Europe. But then when we talk about EU immigration policy, I'm always a bit puzzled by the fact that we tend to avoid talking about what is maybe the biggest part of its migration policy that regards EU citizens. So on the other hand, we have enlargement policies and policies that make union citizen migrants traveling and coming to our countries. These are also part of the EU migration policies, and these are also big part of what is the biggest EU migration design. If we want, this is the first big migration policy of the European Union. So having cheap labor migrants from southern countries, initially Italy, and then enlarging to the Eastern European states to have more labor migrations. So how do you, in a way, also, can we include this in your story? Because to me, there is also another crisis that is happening nowadays, which is the one following the Brexit, where we see that the UK economy is in a big difficulty because there are no more EU migrants there driving their trucks and so on and so forth. And this is very much out from the migration debate. And this is something that upset me in a way, because the two things should come together. And we fail constantly to have positive narratives about migrants and how migrants actually help our system and economy, just because we kind of, treat them as two separate things. On the one hand, there are migration that is about asylum and people coming from from Africa or Asia, and on the other hand, there are, you know, like EU migrants and so on and so forth. So that was kind of a question and a reflection. Thanks again.
Thanks, Virginia. Virginie, would you like to respond directly to that, and then I'll take the question in the chat, and also members of the audience, please put your hands up if you would also like to be recognized.
Thanks, Virginia. From Virginie to Virginia, we are sisters. It's precisely when I say, you know, immigration, asylum, and border policy is just about borders, because when it comes to immigration, meaning soliciting migrants, wanting to welcome migrants because you need them in both in actually highly skilled jobs or lower skilled jobs, or service, you know, in all sorts of services or industry or seasonal workers, then there is no cooperation between member states. There is no incentive for member states to cooperate at a large level to say, let's have a common EU policy on welcoming legal migrants. Everybody wants their own talent, their own global talent. Germany wants the best, France wants the best, the UK wanted the best. So there's no incentive to actually say, you know, that's the failure of the EU directive that was supposed to be the green card equivalent, right? The blue card directive. So when it comes to actually legal migration in the sense of what we can translate as trying to welcome labor migrants, then every member state is very particular about wanting to be more attractive. There's no incentive to have a common pool of these talents, these global talents, right? At the same time, back to Brexit, I think it's after enlargement, but even before, I mean, the fact that you have this huge pool of labor migrants is, I haven't seen very good economist studies on that, but you know, the effect that it has, that you can, for a number of areas, care workers, the number of, you know, Polish, of course, care workers in Germany, or, you know, Romanian housekeepers in Italy, the role that they've had on providing this kind of work, lowering wage pressure, making, you know, is huge, but it's within the EU labor market. So it has nothing to do with immigration, asylum, and borders policy. Only regards the third country nationals, right? But it's interesting to see that post Brexit, yeah, the UK is missing its care workers, lorry drivers, whatever. But it's a big pool for in the EU of for workers.
Thanks. So Karina Smerkova says she doesn't have a microphone, but wants to ask, what are the implications of the externalization of the EU's migration policy to third countries on the human rights of refugees and displaced people? So it kind of follows on from the theme that we were talking about in terms of the clash between the EU's values and its policies.
I'm sure Florian has a lot to say about this, so I want to share the response here. We have, you know, we had some colleagues who looked at that. I'm thinking of Sandra Lavenex in Switzerland, who sort of explained that the EU perspective was to say we will just export norms to third countries. We will just tell third countries to apply the same norms as we have in Western Europe or the EU. But in fact, it's not exactly what we see, right? So when the EU funds, for instance, Libya, long time ago, for instance, it's EU money that funded this the detention centers in Libya. it's more the idea that precisely there's a sort of normative barrier between in the EU and outside the EU. That's quite convenient in a way. It so happens that in fact the EU is, when it comes to so-called transit and origin country, it is dealing with regimes that are not necessarily democratic or that are, you know, but it's been. I'm trying to find an example where you would actually have a country, a major country of origin or transit that would be a great example of democracy and respect of human rights. But originally it was presented as the EU will export its norms. We will export our norms and our models. So you will do better border controls, but you will also respect human rights and asylum. That was the original idea. But of course, as the major countries that we're dealing with are not the same. At the same time, I really have to put this in perspective beyond the EU. I mean, the countries that are welcoming most of the world's refugees, most of the major flows, also very massive flows, are in Latin America, they're in Asia and Africa. And, you know, of course, and some regimes are democratic, some are not, some respect human rights, some are not, but they are the ones who are receiving the Rohingyas, the Uyghurs, the Venezuelans. So there's something really strange about Europe that, you know, we are worried about 2,000 people coming from Belarus. Or, so the question of norms, of, you know, this idea that we were superior, that the Western norms of the EU were superior. In the end, you see regimes that are not particularly on the, you know, on the top list in terms of respecting democratic or human rights norms, having to deal with this, massive influx of displaced persons or refugees, and managing not so badly. I'm thinking especially about Latin America.
Virginie, can I add one sentence there? Because at the beginning, you searched for an example and you mentioned also the Sandra Lavenet and her work. So in her group, there was, for instance, Tina Freiberg, and she made the argument that the EU possibly contributes to the upgrade of some human rights norm for asylum seekers in third countries by influencing the legislation of neighboring states. So she took, for instance, the Morocco law and said they didn't have really a refugee protection law. And then the EU, through IOM, they helped this country to draft it a bit more in accordance to international standards. So it would be an example to have the EU influencing a third country towards the upgrading of human rights norms. So this was one perspective. And then, as Virginie said, there is this other perspective saying that the EU has a moral obligation to basically also do more to protect the human rights. But there's also a legal contest ongoing right now. For instance, you have in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg right now cases where the EU is, or in particular EU/Italian border practices vis-a-vis Libya brought into question, saying that even if the EU is not directly involved, the Libyan border coast guard, which are accused of serious human rights violations as well, they often act on the basis of Italian European intelligence information. So there is an indirect, also legal obligations for the EU to do more for the safeguarding of human rights in third countries. So I think there are different perspectives you can have on the whole field: moral, political one, a legal one, and then the EU more towards undermining. And sometimes some people have said sometimes it contributes also to higher legal standards in third countries.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned Sandra's work, right? Because it could go both ways. You could think, well, we will indeed delegate to third countries, but imposing our norms in a way with a sort of a contrôle qualité, we say in French, trying to have or whether on the contrary, we export because we know that rights will not be respected. And there has been a lot of change in some countries like Morocco. I mean, the thing is, it's also we're dealing with very different kinds of states of origins on transit. I mean, you cannot compare Morocco, Libya, Niger, Pakistan. I mean, the countries of origins of transit are very, very different.
Thanks. So we have a couple of questions in the chat from Sanchine Chiambert.
Yeah, so I'm a student at the University of Liège in my second year of the master degree in European Studies. And so my first question was about the first historical framework that you have presented. And you said that the European Union focused on the border policy, but I was still wondering why some regulation or directives about asylum have been adopted since. And the second question I have is about more focus on the European Commission. And I just wanted to know how can we describe its positions and philosophy regarding to the management of migration and externalization since 2015. And I thank you for your future answers.
So Virginie, do you want to try to take those?
Okay, the first question is about my life's work since in the last 20 years, because I've worked a lot on the development, I mean the emergence and development and institutionalization of asylum and migration policy there. But to sum it up in one or two sentences, the incentive in the early times, so back to the few countries, basically Benelux, France, Germany, and the few that followed, was really home affairs and justice officials who wanted to have a place where they could cooperate among each other and not worry about, especially those who were dealing with asylum and immigration, in employment and social affairs ministries, in foreign affairs ministries, in all sorts of other kind of institutions. So when they met in the Schengen Executive Committee and then later in this EU comitology, SCIFA and others, they were just among each other. It was just justice and home affairs. There was no discussion about asylum and immigration in a way. And when they were, it was in their lens, I mean, in the way that they saw this. If you look at the way it happens at the national state level, you have people say, well, what about, do we need labor? What about family reunification? What about, so at the EU level, it's become a sort of a club of justice and affairs bureaucrats. I'm making this very, very crude, of course, if you will. So asylum and immigration, as I said, for immigration, I mentioned already that there's really no incentive for EU cooperation on this when it comes to attracting, for instance, highly skilled labor from third countries. And for asylum, we're still very much in a situation where there's a lot, by the way, of what we call horizontal Europeanization, not top down, not from the EU, but of course there's a lot of ways of communication between different asylum agencies. But the reality is that there is still, national competence when it comes to the procedure and recognition rates. So yes, to answer your question, yes, there has been there are many directives on asylum. There are some also on long-term residency and family reunification, but they're precisely directives with very, very vague, very open and vague terminology and open ways of doing it. So that's why most of what we mean by immigration, asylum, and borders policy is very operational. It's the budget of the Frontex agency. It's very concrete things. Of course, visa policy so yes, there are directives. You are quite right, but they're not. And that's also to explain what happens in the Afghan situation. the EU Commission cannot say to in this forum, yes, we will welcome 40,000 refugees. This woman cannot, because it's still a national prerogative to decide whether you want to cooperate on this kind of issue. But anyway, on the historical event, is you start from a particular type of bureaucrats with their own vision, their fear also of the courts. And in the end, they bring with them a lot of security agencies, private companies who are very happy to provide technology to control borders, and becomes like a policy domain. So there's, so it's, when I say immigration control, it's actually a whole constellation of actors, private companies, and, if you look at a camp in Greece, you have security companies controlling the camp, you have NGOs operating, you have, so it's become like a coral reef, attracting a lot of private and NGO interests who are participating in this effort. So over time, it just it sort of self perpetuates in a way.
Florian, do you want to come in on this, or indeed on any of the other points that have been raised in the discussion so far?
I mean, Virginie explained very nicely how it all created. Probably an aspect that could be also asked is often asked in this kind of why Dublin was installed in the beginning. It's also that some states who are at the border, there was a kind of a conditionality link with the Schengen cooperation. So you accept the Dublin rules, doing more on asylum, and then you're part of the border-free internal zone. So this is often also mentioned as one of the explanations why it could be adopted against the interest of some of the states, in particular Italy back then. And another explanation that is sometimes mentioned is that the kind of migratory flows that we are focusing right now, they were not so much in the focus at the time of adopting the Dublin regime. It was much more focused on Eastern Europe and what's going on there. So states more at the southern end of Europe, they probably underestimated from today's perspective what Dublin would imply from their own perspective, apart from all the aspects that Virginie said, that they are kind of, in shielded venues at European Union level, they talked and they create consensus. But I think this is a bit the interest perspective in addition to what we have heard.
That leads me to a last question I want to pose to you and to Virginie, which would run more or less as follows. I mean, you described very well how the focus of EU policy has come to be on border control and trying to externalize control of migratory flows to third countries, and yet there's not much evidence that third countries really want to cooperate with the EU and will play the role that they're being asked to play. It's also pretty difficult to control the EU external border without more open violation of the refugee norms, which would be difficult for the EU to adopt. The Dublin system is in many ways unsustainable because of the pressures it puts on the frontline member states. And so all of that is a kind of sword of Damocles hanging over the Schengen area, which is, I still think, both substantively and even politically, a very important component of the success of the EU. So whereas one can emphasize inertia, deadlock, drift, isn't there a kind of continuing pressure on the EU to find some more durable, also internal solution to these problems? Is it really conceivable that the EU can drift as it is forever?
I hope Florian has an answer to this question. 2015 is a good year to start, because we saw how many states in the EU reinstated internal borders, right? Way before COVID, by the way, and but it was typically a good test. So EU internal borders are reinstated all the times, by the way. When there is a football match, when there are activists for instance, there's Glasgow coming up with Coke, so typically that's when you can reinstate EU internal borders. But some of them, like the French borders towards Germany, Italy, and Spain, have been more or less closed since 2015. So you cannot even say that there's a functioning Schengen area since this time. It's funny because nobody talks about it, and I guess with COVID, it's not even easy to see. So it's not even as if we have the benefit of having this external border, because we have fluid internal borders. It's become much more complicated since 2015. My main interest as I'm a comparativist, but I'm also interested in international relations, is how much are we going to pay with in terms of international relations with this obsession about migration? So that's why I mentioned Belarus. The fact that countries know that the EU has made immigration control a priority gives them an enormous, often geographical rent. So if you're Morocco, Libya, if you're on the southern coast of the Mediterranean, you know that, or if you're Turkey, you know that just the threat of sending a few thousand persons across the border gives you enormous leverage on any kind of issue. I mean, so Morocco did it in recently last spring. Turkey did it in 2020. Belarus is doing it now. So it's giving, in terms of international relations, the fact that you say that for reasons that have nothing to do with the EU, by the way. I mean, you have national debates on immigration, you have extreme, radical right parties doing well, but these third countries know that they can use migrants as a sort of leverage, as a sort of point. And the EU has not been able to deal with this very well. I mean, it's a cost-benefit analysis. We signed, the EU signed an agreement with Turkey in March 2016. Yes, there were less flows for a while, but there's still this idea that Erdogan knows, just like the Moroccan regimes or others, that this is really a point of leverage. So when you say externalization, what you forget to say is it's not a simple delegation from a principal to an agent. You are in a situation where, especially at this point, where you should take the person that you are negotiating with as an equal. And in many of these negotiations, I think the EU and member states treat them as in a sort of paternalistic, almost sort of post-colonial way, as yes, they need us. They need us for commerce. They need us for trading relations, for all sorts of reasons, and underestimating the fact that the leaders of these countries are very happy to use immigration as a leverage in international negotiations.
Thanks. I see we're about to wind up, but I do see one last question from somebody called Zabihullah. So Zabihullah, if you want to put on your camera and identify yourself, and also unmute and ask your question, and then we'll wind up.
Thank you for giving me a chance. My name is Zabihullah Obaidi. I'm a student at Queen Mary University of London. I'm from Afghanistan. Thank you for a very professional presentation. I really enjoyed not only the presentation, but also the discussions. I was taking some notes when you had your presentation. So I'm going to look at my notes and to comment on a very specific issue that you just raised on the EU policy regarding the third countries to accommodate Afghan immigrants and asylum seekers, and to avoid asylum seekers coming to EU borders. Well, my question is that do you see it as an effective policy to avoid immigrants and also asylum seekers to come to UK? Because for me, it's not an, I don't see it as an effective policy to avoid immigrants and asylum seekers to come to UK, to EU. Well, this is for two reasons. First, I was in Afghanistan on August 15, in the fall of Kabul, and on 21st August, I received an email from UK government to come to the Baron camp, which is adjacent to Kabul airport. And when I came there in the Baron camp, the Baron camp is a very large place adjacent to the airport, Kabul airport. It has so many gates, different gates, and each gate was administered by different countries. US was there, UK was there, France, Germany, Spain. So each gate was administered by different countries, and it was like a train station with different platforms for Afghan people trying to get into the Baron camp and taking one of those flights to one of those countries. Because and the only reason was that people didn't want to leave, and they still don't want to leave under the Taliban regime. So basically, US, UK, and all NATO countries were taking people who worked with them in last 20 years. But as a witness, I saw so many Afghan peoples trying to get in and take one of those flights, and they were not, and those people have never worked with one of these countries. So the only reason for them to get in and to take one of those flights were that they didn't want to live under the Taliban regime and control and government. And secondly, neighbor countries are not welcoming to Afghan migrants and asylum seekers. You know better that on August 15, all of our neighbor countries, except Tajikistan, closed their borders. And so currently speaking, the price of a flight ticket from Kabul to Pakistan is $2,500. Previously, it was $150. So that means that Pakistan, other countries, they are not welcoming. And this is not a very ideal destination for Afghan people. Because they want to come to EU countries, other countries, that is their final destination. You cannot avoid them. So seeing it as an Afghan or through the lens of Afghan people, the situation, you cannot avoid mass migration to EU countries unless you change the situation in Afghanistan. For example, now EU and also US, United Kingdom, they are putting political pressures on Taliban regime to respect human rights, respect women's rights, and most importantly, to establish what they call an inclusive government. So for Afghan people, a solution would be to improve the situation in Afghanistan. If people get their human rights, and if women have their basic human rights, the right to work, for example, then it will avoid the mass migration from Afghanistan to EU countries and other final destinations currently. So to conclude, the policy shift, a policy shift of the EU towards third countries to accommodate Afghan nationals, for me, it is not effective. I'm really curious to know your points and your answer to that. Thank you.
Okay, Virginie, do you want to react?
Yeah, I don't want to have the final word. You don't have the final word. Just, thank you very much for bringing us back to the origin of the panel. Indeed, so when the EU says we'll give money to Pakistan, I mean, it's not as if Pakistan, by the way, has been hosting many Afghan refugees, but not just Afghan, right? I mean, we have Syrian refugees. Pakistan has been hosting millions of refugees from very different, from Iraq, from Iran, from all sorts of places, right? So it's not, I mean, it's not a question of Pakistan, but to say that Pakistan would be we're just going to give a few million euros to Pakistan, a bit like they did with Turkey after 2015. After 2000, you know, the deal with Turkey was to say 3 billion before, 3 billion 3 years later when you have accepted our deal. So it's, you're right, it's sort of transposing a system of saying, you know, it's a sort of financial transaction and cooperation, as if all the situations are the same. And of course, yeah, no, Turkey is not Pakistan, and the Afghan situation is not the same one as probably the Syrians in 2015, and you're quite right. But what you mentioned is this, and I know exactly what you mean, because it was already the same in 2015, is there is no EU guichet, as we say in French and in Iranian. You know, there's not a place where there's someone called the EU who says, you know, I will welcome Afghan refugees. There is France, there is the UK, there is Germany. You know what I mean? So I think it's a good way to end this conversation. That, in a way, the expectations about a common European immigration and asylum policy on the ground, when it comes to welcoming refugees, asylum seekers, doesn't exist, right? It's still member states, individual states, whether the member states or not, who actually do this. And this was already the case in 2015. So that's why in the end, what we see of EU policies is things like Frontex or cooperation, you know, or cooperation with third countries, but definitely not when it comes to actually welcoming people. We're still very much in a nation state system. And I'm glad to say, with migrants, yeah, being able to some extent to decide which I mean, it sounds very horrible, but you know, deciding which way they want to go, which country they want to go to.
Well, I think we've run over our time.
Sorry, yeah.
No, that's fine. I want to thank Virginie. I want to thank Florian, the discussant. I want to thank you, our remaining audience. This was a great way to kick off our first seminar. I hope we may see some of you at our next seminar on the 18th of November. The topics will, of course, rotate. And our vice chair, Natasha Wunsch, and colleague will present on polarization or accommodation, explaining the discourse vote choice gap in the European Parliament. So I hope we'll see you, you know, at the same time, same channel, as we say in the United States, a month from now. So thanks everybody, and enjoy your evening.